Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our event on the Blackbox, the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, presentation of a study and an exchange. Why the camera is now somebody else escapes my understanding. So the one who is, let's make some exercise that you try to move your mouth according to what I'm saying, and then we'll see whether the confusion will be complete or not. So very warm welcome to this event and to our guests and to our speakers. We have around 80 people that signed up for being interested in this event. As we are now used to hybrid events, the majority of them is out there in the virtual room via WebEx, so they can only see a member of the Ombudsman's office. But nevertheless, we are all here. I think he's the best looking one on the panel anyway, and that's how the camera decided. So, which nevertheless makes it that in the absence of seeing our faces, I would like to introduce my co-host, Anna Cavazzini, sitting next to me, who is the chair of the Committee for Internal Market and Consumer Protection and from the Greens EFA group. And we are co-hosting this event together. That has, of course, a particular reason, since we have a common history when it is about the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, as we both have an interest in the initiative on the right to repair that was now proposed by the Commission recently, but was supposed to be presented way earlier and got at least postponed by half a year due to a negative opinion of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. On the basis of which we have then filed a request for access to documents that was rejected by the RSB. But that's not the only reason why we want now to have a different look into this black box. But we're interested in, of course, the role that this obscure body is playing. On the panel is, and I very much welcome on my right side, the European Ombudsman, although I never understood why it's called Ombudsman or Ombudswoman. But let's say it's officially the European Ombudsman, but for me it's the European Ombudswoman, Emily O'Reilly, who is here and will give in a moment introductory statements. And I would only like to recall at that moment of time that the European Ombudsman has started an investigation into the relationship between the RSB and, let's call it, third parties. And we are therefore very grateful that she's today here with us to present introductory remarks and to listen to the presentation of the study. At this moment of time, I can already announce that she has unfortunately to leave us a bit earlier, but will be indeed here for the presentation of the study. I then have Professor Dr. Brigitte Pircher, is the author of this study that attempted an academic look into this black box with interesting conclusions that we are all very curious to hear about in a bit, and Dr. Frank Ey from the Chamber of Labor Arbeiterkammer Vienna in Austria. And we will then indeed start in the following with an introductory remark by the European Ombudswoman, a presentation of the study, a debate, Q&A session, and closing remarks by Anna Cavazzini. You may, for the Q&A session, raise the hand if you're in the room. For all those that are out there in the virtual space, please make use of the chat function. I'm here monitoring on my iPad the questions that are coming in from the digital room, and I will then introduce them into the debates. Quickly, because time is a scarce source, as already mentioned, the Regulatory Scrutiny Board is an interesting kind of creature. In our legislative procedures, it was now very prominently, as just mentioned, the right to repair, but even more prominently on the proposals for the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which was probably and still is the most heaviest lobbyist legislative file of this term. And the NGO Corporate European Observatory has found out that there were contacts between the RSB and certain interest groups in the preparation of the opinions of the RSB, which raised some questions about the powers, the reach, and the way of how they deal with it, given that we as legislators have to make transparent with whom we are talking about. Access to documents requests filed by MEPs in both files were not successful and got rejected on very general terms. The RSB was created in 2015 as part of the so-called better regulation agenda, and the job of which is to assess a legislative proposal before it's actually proposed, so before it is sent to the legislator. It makes an assessment of the impact assessment, by that concluding whether there is a certain kind of efficiency or not of this particular proposal before the legislator makes its own assessment, how much burden they want to put on the shoulders of businesses, consumers, or others. The European Commission ultimately can also overrule double negative opinion by the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, yet this is, of course, comes along with a lot of political costs. Besides the way that there are some political options that never see the light of the political process, which makes it also very costly in political terms to reintroduce them by means of amendment, there's also a temporal dimension. The right to repair being a case in point. The right to repair is something that is part not only of as an initiative to reform consumer protection, but it belongs to the legislative files of empowering consumers and reforming equity sign, the equity sign rules. Now they are treated with quite some time difference, and also risk that the right to repair might have to be delayed by the very fact that there's a European election coming, which is an unfortunate point and creates only inconsistent, incoherent, and by that actually inefficient EU legislation. That makes it that we have here an internal body that has quite significant powers, but is difficult in terms of accountability. And that makes it necessary to take a closer look into this black box of the RSB. Having said this, I would then now like to hand over to the European Ombudswoman, Emily O'Reilly. Emily O'Reilly is already quite long in this position. She got appointed in the year 2013, reappointed after the European elections in 2014 and 2019. She was before, in the years 2003 to 2013, the first female ombudsman and information commissioner in Ireland. And in that has very much shaped the action and the profile of this very important institution that is here. Here we are. Hello. As has very much shaped and the profile of this institution that is working on behalf of us all union citizens in order to check on the quality of the administration of European bodies and institutions. So I hereby would like to give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you to Mr. Rapazzi and Ms. Cavazzini for inviting me here today, and to Ms. Pircher for her research on the activities of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board and their impact on EU lawmaking. The European Union is currently creating and implementing legislation that will shape the future of our continent, even our planet, for many decades. Many of those laws and regulations seek to confront unprecedented environmental challenges and to adapt to and regulate for the enormous social changes brought about by digitalization and new technologies. It is therefore vital that these new rules reflect the democratic wishes and expectations of EU citizens. Climate change is already impacting the lives not just of those in faraway places, but right here and right now in Europe itself. And citizens therefore expect strong action, both from their national governments and from the European Union. So, meeting their expectations requires a thoroughly transparent legislative process and assurances that special interest groups do not unduly influence lawmakers. There is an ongoing tension between those who want radical action now, for example, to avert climate change catastrophe, and those who seek to slow the pace of reform in order to protect certain industrial and other interests. How these tensions are managed has quite literally life and death consequences. Against this backdrop, the Regulatory Scrutiny Board is both a significant influencer and an outlier vis-à-vis the normal standards of public awareness and public scrutiny. It is, as you've already said, relatively unknown, not only to the majority of the European public, but even to many people working in EU affairs. Yet it has an enormous amount of responsibility at an early stage in the legislative process. Its role in reviewing draft impact assessments and other evaluations can shape EU rules long before they reach the desks of MEPs and national ministers. So for this reason, it is crucial that the board's work is transparent enough to be subject to democratic scrutiny and that its members represent the interests of European society as a whole. Otherwise, we risk legislation that is inadequate for the challenges that I have mentioned, but which also heightens concerns about the outsized influence of big business and special interest groups. I am aware that many civil society organisations and journalists have already raised concerns around how the board operates and how its composition. I have recently opened 2 inquiries related to the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. They are both ongoing, so I cannot share any conclusions yet, but I can nevertheless provide some information about the scope of the issues that we're looking into. So the first inquiry concerns the composition of the board, as well as how the board interacts with special interest representatives. The complainant in this case argues that interactions between board members and interest representatives may have affected the board's work, for instance, on the draft EU directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. They are also concerned about the composition of the board, which they allege favours economic expertise over expertise in environmental and social policy. I will note here that the Regulatory Scrutiny Board mission statement requires that the expertise of members should cover, quote, macroeconomics, microeconomics, social policy, and environment policy. You know this off by heart. I have sent a series of questions to the European Commission to ask how it makes sure that the board's composition covers all these areas of expertise and to provide information on what safeguards are in place when it comes to the board's interactions with stakeholders. And I expect to receive the Commission's answers by the end of this month. The other inquiry concerns the Commission's refusal to give full public access to the declarations of interest of Regulatory Scrutiny Board members following a request from a journalist. These declarations provide important information on potential conflicts of interest. The Commission argues that the information in them is personal data that should remain confidential. And this, to me, is an example of an occasional conflict we see between data protection requirements and accountability. I have issued a solution proposal in this case, asking the Commission to consider providing wider disclosure. I will conclude by noting that the Commission's better regulation agenda is intended to ensure evidence-based and transparent lawmaking based on the views of those affected. The Commission has given the Regulatory Scrutiny Board significant influence in determining the information and analysis that comprise the early stages of the legislative process. As such, the Commission has an obligation to make sure the board is transparent and accountable, and that it operates in accordance with all the principles of good administration. And through my investigations and likely proposals for improvement, I will work to help to ensure that that is the case. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your intervention. Yes, you can also applaud. And also from my side, welcome in the room, welcome to this, I think, very important event. And Ms. O'Reilly, we're really, really happy that you also started these investigations because, as my colleague René Repasi said, there had been problems in the past when it comes to transparency. For example, also, I tried to find out what the Commission changed between the different versions of some pieces of legislation that were postponed by the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, for example, also on the customs proposal. But yeah, right to repair, due diligence, there's a lot of them, and it's very hard to find out. But thank you so much for your work. I think we are really looking forward to the result of the inquiries. Can you probably say when they will be finalized?
Well, the Commission will be back to us in June, the end of June. Yeah, yeah. And we're very transparent, so you see all of the toing and froing on our website.
Great, very good. So you will stay a little bit, and now we have the pleasure to hear the results of the study. I welcome Ms. Pircher. She is Associate Professor at the Linnaeus University, Sweden since 22. Yes. And previously she held posts at the University of Vienna and also Linnaeus University and Copenhagen Business School. And you conducted the study. We are very much looking forward also together with your colleague, of course, to hear the results and afterwards have a discussion on the way forward, probably also on the lessons learned from your study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the two MEPs, Cavazzini and Repasi, who made it possible actually to have such an event. I think it's very, very important to discuss those issues, and I'm very happy that I have the possibility also to today share the research findings, some of the research findings that I did study on the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. And I also thank very much Ms. O'Reilly on this very interesting speech on the ongoing investigations. At the very beginning, I would like to say that my study was financed by the Chamber of Labour Vienna together with Lobby Control. Before I jump directly into the findings of the study, I would like to say a couple of words on the aim of the study and the methods. Beginning with the aim, so the first aim was to provide a literature review on the better regulation agenda and the establishment of the RSB. So provide an historical background, like how did it all evolve, so to say. Then the second aim was to look at the activities. So interestingly, there's actually only one comprehensive scholarly scientific work on the RSB so far done that actually looks specifically on the RSB opinions and whether they contribute to better regulation. And that study assessed that, yes, they contribute to better regulation, but then at the same time, we actually have other research and other studies, and especially NGO reports that actually cast doubt on this interpretation. So that was kind of the puzzle. To look not specifically on like what the RSB is doing within the opinions, but also what is the role of the RSB and what is a potential influence that the RSB can have. By doing so, I also included here the main voices of critiques that have emerged over the last years. Then briefly to my methods. So I looked at all the EU documents that primarily, of course, is based on the European Commission documents, the RSB documents, like the annual reports, the different opinions, and so on. Then newspaper articles I analyzed and the different NGO and interest group reports. To back that up, I actually also conducted elite interviews. I asked, as you can see on my slides, I asked a lot. I was only able to actually gather then 7 elite interviews. However, I would like to stress that there has been theoretical saturation reached, so meaning that the responses have been redundant. So the focus was a qualitative approach, and I looked at specific examples, where actually the RSB has been criticized very much. So most likely examples where the RSB has a critical role in the legislative process, but then also other examples where the RSB issued negative opinions. Before I come to my conclusions of the study, I briefly would like to lay out the process that we heard already by Mr. Repasi at the beginning. But I think it's important here to stress that after the Commission sets the priorities, as you know, it's the DJs to evaluate existing law and consult and make the draft impact assessment. And then it's actually the RSB who scrutinizes those draft impact assessment and issue an opinion, which can be negative, positive, or positive with reservation. If it's not positive, it goes back to the DGs. They have to incorporate it, the RSB comments, it goes back to the RSB. They again assess it. Again, there can be negative and positive opinions. And in the case of 2-second negative opinion, it's actually moved. So it's only the Vice Commissioner that lays it forward to the College of Commissioners, who then make a decision whether to propose the legislation or not. So not only I, also previous research argued that this is a kind of de facto veto position, not a de jure. So I'm not arguing it has a veto position, but it is de facto veto position that the RSB here has. And you can see due to the workflow that it takes a lot of time and it's a back and forth. So of course that can occur also delays in that process. If we look now how often that occurs, those negative or positive opinions from 2016 to 2022, you can see here that it doesn't happen so often in about 38% 50% of the cases there is a negative opinion. When we look at the second negative opinion, there are not many, but especially in 2021, we see actually the highest number, which are 4, which I think also is maybe like also a reason why the RSB landed in the public discussion more than it did before. Yeah, and now to my findings. So when looking at the RSB activities and at the RSB work, we can actually see from the reasoning of the RSB opinions that there is a strong focus on economic criteria. So out of these 9 negative opinions that have been issued, second negative opinions, 6 are in the area of social and environmental policies. And when we look closer to this negative and second negative opinion, there is a strong focus on economic criteria. To give you 2 examples, the one example is the equal pay between men and women. And the other example is the preventing gender-biased violence. And here, the RSB very much argued that there is a lack of global cost-benefit analysis. So it's basically economic criteria that are taken into account, whereas there is less of a focus on long-term impacts for society. Then, as mentioned by Mr. Repasi already at the beginning, the corporate sustainability due diligence. Here there are the experts in the room, in the house, so to say, on that. I looked more on the RSB roles when it comes to this negative opinion. And what we actually can see is that these roles, that they can issue 2 negative opinions, very much politicized the decision-making process in the legislators afterwards. And that specifically is also because the RSB opinions, they are only published after the Commission proposal is finalized. Thank you. Yes, and yeah, and that of course leads to questions of transparency. So of course, one can argue, where does transparency begin? Where does it end? And I'm not arguing for complete and full transparency, but it needs to be more clear what the RSB is actually doing and how the RSB is shaping the draft impact assessment that accompany then the legislative proposal. One idea could be that they actually make it clear when publishing the proposal what the role here explicitly was from the RSB. Another idea would be to actually publish the opinions before the proposal is finalized. The same happened with the consumer right to repair, and Mr. Repasi mentioned that at the beginning. So there have been MEP asking for access to the negative opinions by the board. That access has been denied by the European Commission. I also argue here that there is like a lack of access to those documents that we actually have. So for example, the RSB issues opinion, that's official, available. So in that sense, they are transparent. But at the same time, for normal citizens in Europe, it's very, very hard to actually find those specific opinions. So it would be quite easy from my point of view to connect RSB opinions and the impact assessment all together on your legs with the directive and the legislative proposal. Yeah, then another finding is that the composition of the RSB, as you know, it favors the Commission because we have half of the members, they are internal, half are external, but then the chair is actually also from the Commission, so it favors the Commission in that sense. But even more so if there are problems with full capacity. So if you look at the last years, there have been severe problems in actually having full capacity of the board members. So when I started conducting the study, there have been 4 members, now there are 6 members, but it was never fully staffed. And the internal are more easy to recruit. So again, it favors the Commission here more. Also, it's difficult for external to come for a period of 3 years to Brussels. One should think about that too. Then, and that's the last point, is in terms of accountability, to what extent is the RSB held accountable by the public? So what are the channels of accountability or the ways if unsound practices are established by the board? And then the question is, of course, okay, now these are the findings. So how do we move on from here? So I argue that maybe it's, I made a different policy recommendation, and it all boils down maybe to one major policy recommendation. And I argue maybe it's time to evaluate. There hasn't been any independent evaluation on the RSP. There are 8 years now in office without any evaluation. There is rich data on the board. We have a lot of opinions. We have a lot of documents. One can identify the strengths and weaknesses, implement changes. And I think that would benefit actually all sides. It would ensure greater credibility also for the board. So I think that would be a way forward and a good time for that as well. And just on my last slide, here you can see where you can access the study that I made. And beside, I also used the opportunity to include more recent work of mine on EU decision-making processes and the implementation of EU law. And I thank you very much for that. And I'm looking forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation of the study. And indeed, this also merits some applause. Particular the last slide on the political recommendations raised, of course, questions of what kind of political consequences should be attached to the findings of the study. And someone who can give us some indications in which direction political consequences could go to is Dr. Frank Ey from the Arbeiterkammer Wien. And he's their consultant in the EU and International Affairs Department of the Arbeiterkammer, but also active as an academic, as a lecturer at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. And in that capacity, he deals with the questions of the EU internal market and lobbying at EU level. Unfortunately, both elements are rather interconnected with each other. The Arbeiterkammer and lobby control have together commissioned the study. So therefore now, Dr. Ey, what is your take on it?
Yes, thank you. First of all, a very short information about my organization. The Austrian Federal Chamber of Labor is founded by law and representing the interests of about 4 million employees and consumers in Austria. It gives legal advice to its members last year in more than 2 million cases in many different fields relevant to our members, such as social, consumer, educational, tax, and housing issues. And part of our tasks is also to represent the interests of our members in the legislative process on national and EU level. And the Chamber of Labor is also part of the Austrian Social Partnership. Concerning the RSP, what is the reason why lobby control, based in Germany, and the Vienna Arbeiterkammer commissioned together a study on the RSP? Over the years, we have noticed that there are often considerable delays and a certain watering down in EU legislation on issues that are especially important from a socio-political point of view. During a closer research in the context of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Act, we came across the Regulatory Scrutiny Board which has a significant influence on legislation through their work. We wanted to investigate this observation in more detail by conducting this study. And as now we can see, the study has produced really interesting results. The study shows that the RSP, due to its de facto veto power, has a considerable influence on the content of such proposals, and the evaluation of impact assessments can lead to changes in these proposals. It's interesting that even the Commission itself has already mentioned that the RSP has a high degree of influence. I just mentioned from a communication just from April 2021 that the Commission said no regulatory oversight body in the member states is given this degree of influence. At the same time, it lacks democratic legitimacy and transparency because its assessment becomes public only after the proposal is published. And if the RSB vetoes a proposal twice, and the responsible vice president of the commission or somebody from the commission then shelves the proposal instead of publishing it, it's not possible to see what role the RSB played because of this proposal was not published. Another problem also concern, as we have heard already, the composition of the board. We have now 6 members on the board. Normally it should be 9, so 1/3 of the members is missing. The board was never fully staffed since 2019, which highlights a structural problem. In addition, there are also gaps in expertise. For example, there is a lack of expertise in socio-political topics regarding labor, social policy, consumer protection, environmental protection, health protection, animal protection, other important fields, just to name a few topics. It's mainly covered are economic topics. It's not to be understood as a criticism of the experts on the board, but it's really highly concentrated on economic policy issues. Another problem is also that the board is clearly dominated by men. In the case of topics such as a position of the impact assessment on the gender pay gap, for example, it would be very good to have a balanced composition of this board. But this is almost never the case in practice. So we see quite a strong board with veto power, de facto veto power, lack of transparency, board which was never fully staffed since 2019, lack of necessary expertise in a lot of fields. And since the beginning of the work, as mentioned, there was moreover never, despite numerous structural problems, an evaluation. And now I think it's high time to make such an evaluation to solve these structural problems. But there's one more result. It's concerning the better regulation agenda. The better regulation agenda is the starting point or the basis for the RSP. Here we see also a necessity for a revision and an adjustment which should be urgently considered. And these are some of the most important results from this study.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you for presenting the very important findings. And it's, I think, really, really important. We don't have an official evaluation, but that now we have a study that we looked in all the details, did interview. I think that's definitely enriching the knowledge and the debate. But now, of course, we want to also discuss with you. We want to check if you have questions to our experts who did the study, but of course, also if you have political ideas or views on how to probably also continue what to do with the findings. If you're in the room, you can just let me know if you want to speak. We have already also otherwise one question in the chat that I will read out, and 2 questions in the room, and we collect because we are running a little bit out of time. And start, I saw you first and then you, and sorry if I don't know all the names, but you can probably present yourselves and then.
Sure, thank you very much. My name is Alexandra Terzieva. I work for Compassion in World Farming, and we work on the animal welfare legislation. We are an NGO. We fight for better standards for animals. There is currently well, we're waiting for this proposal to come out, and we just heard that, well, recently heard that last month the Regulatory Scrutiny Board rejected the impact assessment that was prepared, like the staff working document on the impact assessment on this legislation. We don't know exactly, well, let's say, we couldn't really provide input in the process, of course. Funnily, at the same time, there's the industry opposing this legislation that has published an impact assessment with very faulty premises for their, future projections. I mean, we can, of course, comment on that, but we don't really know what's happening behind the scenes for the rest. In terms of, for example, like as an example, where you've talked about the necessity of having expertise in social and environmental issues related to proposals. In this case, it was, for example, knowledge of animal welfare that it should have been taken into consideration when projecting economic estimates. They were saying, for example, if you ban cages, which is one of the main topics of the legislation, the revision of the legislation, then that will lead to more piglet mortality, which would increase costs for producers, for consumers, etc., etc. This is not true. The latest study by the European Food Safety Authority says that if the legislation is done properly, if there are certain standards that need to be followed, banning cages is actually going to lead to any increased piglet mortality. So just the very basic premises of their, the industry study is faulty. And unless you actually know anything that is not related to pure economic analysis, but you know a little bit of the subject matter, then you can actually analyze and realize that what they're saying is not true and their projections are not true. So I'm very disappointed in the fact that we are not given a say in the process. We, as experts in animal welfare, are not allowed to guide policymakers into making the right decisions. With this, if we have a second rejection, which is pending, it is not decided yet, but it is possible. That means that the proposal may not go through through this commission. We have a very progressive commission that has committed to end cages in farming, follow the European Citizens Initiative, which is one of only nine successful initiatives since 12 years ago when this tool was created, the only one to which there was a clear commitment to implement all the requests by the citizens in this initiative, the only one. And still, we have this undemocratic process blocking progress. It is shocking. For me, it is shocking. So I want to ask what we can do, especially maybe the cabinet of the ombudsman. Is there anything legally that we can do, given the time restraints that we have? Because if we don't have this now, it's we don't see much hope.
Thank you so much. We're going to definitely take it up and collect questions, but I think it's great but sad that we have another example, and I think your example points to another problem. We don't only have the delay in files that we just start working later on them, but now we're coming towards the end of the term and things might be pushed completely off the cliff because also we don't know how the next parliament looks like, how the next commission looks like. So thanks for this example. I had another question.
Yeah, thank you. Luc Hendricks, SME United, the European SME organization. Thank you for organizing this because this is also a topic that is of high importance for us. Nevertheless, I'm a little bit disappointed about the way it is presented. In my view, it's presented in a too much conflictual way as a conflict between interest. And there I must say on the main critics we fully agree as SME organizations, we fully agree. We have always insisted on an independent RSB. We are also not happy about the fact that they are not published before the proposal of the Commission is published. We have also some remarks on the composition, but we should not see it too conflictual. I mean, also, and I cannot really understand the last critic, oh, RSB is only dealing with better regulation. I mean, it was created exactly to have better regulation. And this is not against consumers or against the rights of trade unions. No, better regulation is there for everybody and is in the interest of everybody. I'm also a little bit disappointed that we were not consulted by the experts on the study. For example, on the Stoiber group, we were very much involved and we had serious comments on it. And I think the last sentence in this short report is, oh yeah, it was mainly about exempting SMEs. No, SME United is in principle against exempting SMEs from legislation because then we are out of the market. We want better regulation that is feasible for the SMEs. And that has nothing to do with conflict between SMEs and industry, not at all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your very valuable contribution. And I think it's really good that that SME United agrees in principle. And probably it's also an important remark how to see how we can join have a common criticism and to make it sure that you are included in it. I think that was a very important remark. So I have 2 online and then 2 more in the room, and then we have an answer. I have seen you an answer round. Sorry for that, but we had to start a little bit late due to technical problems. But I'm sure everyone who wants to speak can speak. So I probably read out the 2 remarks from the chat, and then we have 2 more people in the room, and then we have room to answer. So online from Niels Bjorksten, the RSB only looks at impact assessment and evaluations and comments on their quality. It never looks at policy proposals themselves. So how does the RSB affect those proposals? What evidence is there that RSB has in fact any influence on the proposals? I'm tempting to answer that, but I will leave it to the experts. And then from Juliette Dallure, client Earth, have the Commission or RSB members commented on the study and what is their opinion about it? And then I have 2 more people in the room, please.
Thank you very much. So my name is Florence Bertoletti. I'm a lobbyist defending values as opposed to interests, and I'm the Secretary General currently of an organization called the European Alcohol Policy Alliance. In 2010, I had the honor to publish a report which was called The Origin of the Better Regulation Agenda. And my question will follow, but I want to go back to that particular document because through access to document from the tobacco industry, it was clearly a group of big industrialists, so tobacco, oil, big corporation, international corporations got together and actually pushed for the better regulation agenda. It was all published and it was all there. And the objective was to delay EU policy processes and, of course, to put in place the cost-benefit analysis, which you've mentioned. So I see in many ways the RSB, Stoiber was before, as a tree in the forest. Who, for instance, decides on the methodology and the guidelines for the cost-benefit analysis? All the critics are basically delays, number 1, and number 2, how these cost-benefits analysis are done and the role of the lobby, let alone the composition of the group and who appoints them. But, what is the cost of future generation? Is that taken into account? Who decides? And is it the role of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, or is it the role of the Parliament to have a serious conversation with the next Commission and actually review the overall better regulation package?
Thank you so much. And now, if not, you move to another one. Yeah.
Yeah, now it works. Thank you so much. My name is Ursula Pachel from BIOC, from the European Consumer Association. Firstly, very briefly, thank you very much for this event to the Parliament, but also I want to underline to Arbeitkammer and also in that case lobby control, because I think it's fundamentally important that civil society continues to play a watchdog, because not many civil society organizations have the resources to do so. So thank you very much, very important. I would like to go back to a point I think that Frank already hinted to, which is what is behind the work of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. Is it not the criteria and the toolbox for better regulation that inform the Regulatory Scrutiny Board and the services about what they should look at? And this is the aspect of the economic focus and the overweight of economic burden, which is still in the very center of the narrative of the better regulation agenda. And I was at the previous platform, which was the refit platform, and now is the Fit for Future platform. It's always the same problem. The narrative of the better regulation agenda focuses on burdens on businesses, on economic burdens, instead of looking at what is the overall benefit of legislation and how can we improve European legislation for everybody. And the other point I wanted to mention, what we see in terms of direct contact with Commission services, there is now a much higher degree of, I would say, stress by the services, and that could lead to anticipatory obedience, so to speak, to anticipate maybe what would the Regulatory Scrutiny Board criticize, to make sure that it is not something that is going to halt, and that has an indirect and probably very hard to measure impact already. So my proposals for the future would be, for the next term, I would like to ask the question, do we need a Regulatory Scrutiny Board at all? At the time, it was very much the discussion and the pressure on the better regulation agenda to outsource the impact assessments. That was then the compromise response, but I think I don't see really an added value. And the second thing is what we definitely need. We need a new narrative for the better regulation agenda. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Probably, if you want, we can start with the cabinet of Ms. O'Reilly, because there was one specific question to you, but I don't know if you want to answer. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So my name is Koen Rovers. I'm involved as inquiries officer in some of the inquiries that are ongoing on this subject, and can not comment on these ongoing inquiries. But the question was, I think, whether we would have maybe legal advice for the issue that you presented. I'm unfortunately also not in a position to provide legal advice, but what I can say is that the European Ombudsman as an EU body is there. We can deal with complaints about administrative procedures. The admissibility criteria for complaints includes that the complainant first tries to solve the issue with the institution concerned, meaning that you'd have to try and get in contact with the European Commission on that particular issue and hear what they say. And should you remain dissatisfied with the situation, then you can submit your concerns along with the document to the European Ombudsman, and we can then take a view as regards whether the complaint is admissible and whether there are grounds for an inquiry. That is sort of general information for all of the organizations present. Yeah, should you have any specific technical questions, then I can provide further information.
And the camera loves you.
That would have a short
Yeah, good.
One by SM United. I think this is very interesting, and I would like to hear more. Actually, interviews. I would be very happy to hear more about that, if that's possible, for future research, because I continue working on it scientifically. So that would be very interesting. So thank you very much. I think that was a really interesting view. And then the other comment was on online, on the RSP. And I agree, it does not comment on any policy. That's true. And Ms. Cavazzini maybe has another point on that too. You mentioned that. But of course, that's true. It does not comment on any policy, but it assesses the impact assessment. And by that, by giving negative opinions and laying out what the DGs should actually change, they actually on a second step, then it will be changed at the DGs, the draft impact assessment, and therefore also some parts of the legislative proposal can be changed. So that is also shaping a legislative proposal, and the argument that the RSB would kind of work in a political vacuum, I don't think that holds. Thank you.
It works.
Oh, I'm impressed.
Yes, thank you for all the comments and questions. Yeah, I also see the problem concerning the animal welfare proposal, that there is really a very economic focus on the RSP, despite the toolbox of the RSP was a little bit changed, but I think that's still not enough. Yeah? You still can see that really the focus is still economic and company oriented. And as mentioned already by Ursula Pachel, yeah, there's often, you see, there's a kind of anticipation of what could be a problem for the RSP. And this leads already to changes in the text. It's also a problem. And I think really this board should be reconsidered. It should be changed, maybe even changed by another solution. Yeah? Apart from this RSP, you can check this impact assessments also within the DGs responsible for these issues. They have more expertise than just 6 or 7 or maybe 8, 9, if it's fully staffed people. 6 or 9 people, they can't be experts in all the fields which are discussed on EU level. It's by far too much for them. Yeah, they do their job, of course, but they can't be expert of all the different fields. So this should be changed anyway. Yeah, thanks a lot for your comment from United SME. I think it's also very interesting that they also said we don't want to be exempted from law, and would be interesting to discuss how we can make it as efficient as possible, that both sides are happy with it. Yes. Talk to the Commission. Maybe we find a solution about.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much. Probably now is a difficult task to summarize a little bit and also define next steps, probably for like civil society or other stakeholders, SME United, but also for us. MEPs, and I think, one very concrete case is basically your case, and I think what we, for example, could do is also asking again a written question, just as a matter of principle, to get access to the documents, just to again show that there is transparency and make a case out of it. This is, for example, for this concrete case, one follow-up action, I would say, and then secondly, I think we should really collect some of the ideas of the independent evaluation, of having a more balanced composition, or having other ideas than only economic thinking in this board, but also probably even discussing a complete revolution, or not abolishment, but whatever, restructuring, I don't know. And then really try to have a high level meeting with the Commission where we just also present these ideas. One idea could also be having a written an oral question in the plenary. I mean, I don't know if it makes sense to probably also even try to put these problems on the plenary agenda to make it a little bit more political. And these are some of my conclusions or like next steps after this very fruitful debate. So from my side, already thanks to all of you, but of course also René has probably other follow-up ideas than me. I don't know, better ones, tell me.
Not sure whether they are better, but I mean, I'm already a little bit longer than a year in this parliament. And before that, I was on the other side, purely academic, looking at the issue of the so-called democratic deficit. And the democratic deficit of the European Union is in particular one of lack of acceptance by citizens of what we're doing here in Brussels. And the very reason is huge intransparency issues. And we need, because we need the European Union, we need an efficient European Union, we need a European Union that solves the transnational global problems that we have. We need to have citizens approving and accepting the results of our policy process. And if they are intransparent, then there is a lack of acceptance, and by that undermining the legitimacy of our policy actions. But it's necessary that this is happening. It's therefore I'm a critic of the trialogue system as it is, because we close doors and we cannot put accountability to those that have made certain policy decisions. And therefore I have difficulties with an RSB that has impact, but it's totally intransparent. And in the end, there might be a proposal with a huge impact assessment at the end, and then we see what idea they have. But we saw also in the study that there is an anticipatory effect, that the Commission prices in possible reactions of the RSB and is already drafting proposals in that direction. So if citizens want to know why there's one measure in there or another not in there, and it was actually done because of as consequence of an impact assessment, then this is a problem. And the problem is, if a proposal is out there and we want to change the proposal by means of amendments, it has political costs, and at times it's just not possible given the majority situation in Parliament. Those who set the political agenda define major parts of the outcome of a policy proposal. And that's the reason why we have to be critical with all those veto players that can veto, postpone, delay legislative processes. And there is no accountability and no transparency because citizens then don't know what is happening here. And we come to a situation that proposals might not even see the light because of being pushed to the cliff of elections, or the European legislator has to deal with it. Ultimately, my main point of view is here, it's for the legislator to decide who has to take certain burdens, and not any other body to take this decision. Only legislator is democratically legitimate for this. That makes it we have to look closer into what the RSB is doing. Here we have another legislative procedure to look at. The better regulation debates that we have every year is another opportunity to make use of this. The proposals that you have mentioned are this. We are now getting a new commission, hearings for a new commission president, hearing for new commissioners. It's here a possibility to give proper shape to the RSB if possible, so that if there is any added value to it, that is actually shaped, but it must be closely linked to transparency and accountability. And I'm also looking forward to the outcome of the investigations of the EU Ombudsman. So thank you very much for having been here with us, online and here in the real world. And we will certainly continue to closely observe the activities of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. Thank you so much.